Okay. Welcome to the 2026 Spring NDE World Language CLTA Special Interest Group K-12 and NEPLA Guest Speaker Series. Today we have our last webinar in this series. We have Caitlin Cornell, and I'm so excited because she's going to talk about a topic we have never had before, but it's definitely very interesting for us. Caitlin, please take it away. Thank you.
Sure thing. Thank you so much for having me, first of all. I'm going to talk a little bit about disability and additional language teaching today. And before I introduce myself, which I'll do in just a second, I wanted to draw your attention to the top right of the title slide here. And there you'll find a QR code that will take you to these slides if you want to follow along. So I'll give just a moments of pause here so that people can use their cell phones to get that QR code if they want to. But I'll also repeat the QR code on the last slide of the presentation. So now is not your only chance to do that. And you are also always welcome to email me. What I've done on the title slide is I've linked to my personal professional website. And once you're on my website, it's pretty easy to find my email address in the contact tab. So even if the QR codes for some reason don't work for you today, or you don't want to haul out your phone in the middle of the webinar to do that, you can definitely get the slides by getting in touch with me. I'm also really happy to take concrete questions. I do get into specifics, but today is pretty much an overview. And so if there's anything more specific that folks really want to talk about in a little more depth, please feel free to email me. So I'll hang out here just another couple seconds, and then we'll get into introductions and more stuff. And again, the QR code will appear again all the way at the end of the presentation. Okay. So here's my plan for today. I hope to tell you a little bit about me and how I came to the work. I'll cover some important definitions and kind of give us some language to use at this intersection of disability inclusion and language teaching and learning. Then I'll address some common barriers. So I'll really kind of dig in and talk more in depth about where there's sometimes, but not always, but sometimes challenge in language study for disabled students. And then we'll talk a bit about some inclusive practices, and then I'll wrap up with some final advice. So, meet Caitlin. I thought I'd share some personal and professional parts about me that I think just kind of help people see how I came to be interested in the intersection between language pedagogy and disability inclusion. So the first thing to mention, if I go all the way back to the beginning, I grew up in a disabled family. Just as one example, we have a few disabilities in the family, but my grandfather was legally blind, for example. And I could go into more detail about that, but I think generally that just points to the fact that for a really long time in my life, I was sort of already attuned and kind of sensitive and interested in the concept of being disabled and living life, but also learning. And as a language person myself, I brought that into the interest of how that intersects with language study specifically. And then I taught English in the US and abroad for many years, mostly young adults, like 17 to 19-year-olds, sometimes for some pre-credit college English, for example. And I found myself kind of ill-equipped, actually, to support my disabled students in my classes. And it's not always because I knew they had a disability. Sometimes that was true, but also because I just felt like there were some additional needs happening that I wasn't trained for. I didn't really know what to do or help those students. I wish that my master's program had sort of better prepared me to address at least certain learner differences. We can't maybe prepare for everything, but I was definitely feeling that there were certain things that I wasn't as prepared for as I would like, let's say. And so I decided to return to research, kind of as a way to understand better learners' challenges and resources that they're bringing, but also to be able to better support instructors in their inclusive pedagogy, because that's what I wished for. So now I research and support accessible and inclusive teaching and learning broadly, actually, in one of my roles. And I have a specific interest in disability inclusive additional language learning and teaching also. So at the moment, I'm at Michigan State University. I say at the moment, I've been there for a while and I will be there for another long while. I'm not very transient in this way. I'm very settled at MSU, but I have two roles. I'm the assistant director of a language center, the language or the Center for Language Teaching Advancement. And then also, since just this past January, I'm also the accessibility coordinator and advocate for the College of Arts and Letters at MSU. So this is wonderful for me because it's kind of the first time that I've been able to formally do both of my interests at the same time. You know, before I was a language person in a language center, bringing in the disability and inclusion piece, and now I have this other role that's very dedicated formally to the disability inclusion and accessibility piece. So that's very fun for me. And I also teach a course on accessibility for language teaching in a graduate program that trains language teachers. So you can see that I'm very steeped rather in this interest of mine. And I think the last thing to know about me, which is a good segue into what we're going to talk a little bit more about today, I agree with longtime language instructor Elizabeth Hamilton. I think she taught German. Don't quote me on that. Foreign language teachers have an ethical mandate to make classes accessible that operates in concert with principled foreign language instruction, right? She was speaking specifically about foreign language here, but I think this applies to all additional language teaching contexts. We want to teach well, and there's research and experience that tells us how to do that, and also we want to do it accessibly. So now let's start by setting some parameters. So for example, what counts as a disability when I say that? When I say that word, what do I mean? Well, it depends on who you ask. And so on this slide, I'm going to give you one way to think about it. Someone might be identified as disabled. So in this case, someone is doing the identifying of someone else and their disability, or someone identifies as disabled. And this is where the disabled person is identifying as disabled. This is a dichotomy, or this way of thinking about this is coming from an article I wrote with a colleague in 2023 that appeared in an issue of the Language Testing Journal. I'm just throwing that out there in case that's interesting for you. In the case, oh, sorry, I'm over clicking. In the case of identified, someone else, like I said, is doing the identifying, right? Potentially someone who doesn't know the person very well, at least, or share the condition. So, for example, it could be like a medical provider, and maybe the interpretation of that label serves for the Office of Disability Services or for maybe the special education department, for example, depending on which context we're talking about, that sort of proves the membership of someone being disabled and belonging to that group, right? In the case of identifies, a disabled person is self-identifying, as I mentioned. They might have a documented disability, and actually also they might not. There's some overlap here, right? Depending on your values and belief system, but also, as I'll talk about on the next couple of slides, the teaching context that you're coming from, you might believe, like I tend to, that people should be able to self-identify things like this because some of the official processes that we have to deal with that can be a bit more rigid and they rely on very specific definitions. Those processes can be really cumbersome. They can be expensive. For example, in the case of medical diagnoses, they can be a bit oppressive and sometimes even risky or traumatic. Nevertheless, very often we have to go through them to get the services that we want. And like I said, I'll talk about that more on the next couple of slides. So I guess I just want to round off this idea by saying that we know that not only the label, but also who is doing the identifying is tremendously important, especially in certain educational contexts, right? So this brings us to talking about, what does disability look like in educational contexts that are K-12? So the definition of a disability is a documented need that depends on eligibility categories written into state legislation. So in K-12 settings, just to sort of summarize or paraphrase this, being identified as having a disability means a specific set of conditions, or we might use a different word there, but condition or disability, that the federal government can legally pay to accommodate for. So it's very specifically the things that are eligible for funding, right? And so that means that some of the terms that you might have heard are not exactly what you would expect them to be. An example that I sometimes give is having ADHD. Let's say you've got diagnosed ADHD in a student. but there isn't an educational diagnosis in K-12, or they don't fall into the eligibility criteria for the funding, then yes, there's a definition of disability, but it doesn't necessarily in K-12 translate to services. And that's quite complicated. And there are other resources where you can look for more specific information about that than just listening to me. But generally speaking, the eligibility for which services depends on how much a student's learning is affected and whether or not the content, for example, of lessons needs to be differentiated. For example, that ends up being sometimes the difference between whether a student qualifies for a 504 plan or an individualized education plan. But again, there are much more nuanced state level resources that you should consult to know kind of how that works in your state. All of these practices, so my point here is that all of these practices are tied up very much in the language that we use to describe disability and how it's manifesting in education. And just for a very quick point of comparison, I won't spend a lot of time on this. In higher education, it happens a little bit differently. Eligibility for services depends partly on federal legislation, but also sometimes on the institution's policies and the institution's sort of culture around disability. So, for example, individualized education plans don't transfer from the from the high school landscape because the funding legality is different in higher education, especially depending on the institution, whether it's a state-funded institution or not, for example. But 504 plans, I fairly recently learned, can sometimes transfer over to the higher ed scenario if I think the Disability Service Center approves of those accommodations, and those accommodations on the 504 still seem reasonable in the college setting. So there is some opportunity for transfer between those educational contexts. I would say that there might be, this is sort of anecdotal evidence, there might be a little more room for self-identification, like I said, the identifies piece of this, and a little less need for the same rigid procedures around medical and educational diagnoses in higher education than K-12. And again, largely that's tied to funding models. So words matter. When it comes to describing the learning of or referring to disabled students, our language choices matter a great deal, like they do for other individuals and communities of marginalized identities. Word choices can tell us a lot about each other, even unintentionally, and terms can align us ideologically and along identity lines, and even actually generationally. We may have been raised in different, I'm calling them turns of terminological sensitivity, right? These terms get updated very often because they become sort of out of use and outdated with certain communities, right? So, and as we've seen, on the past couple of slides, terms can really define eligibility criteria and therefore determine funding support. So, right, so words matter quite a lot. There's a lot of weight there. I want to highlight one choice that we have, just as an example of some of the language that we can use around disability. So we have this choice of identity first language or person first language, and those look like this. Identity first language is just kind of a different construction where you move the word disability and you front it as an adjective. I have moved to using that one because disabled friends, colleagues, and activists are pushing toward that. But we hear more of person first language in K-12 contexts, and also I think in healthcare settings, you're more likely to see person first language. And there are group and condition specific terms too. So for example, in blind and visually impaired communities, it's okay to say visually impaired, or visual impairment, but impairment is not a term that everyone endorses across groups. So in the case of hearing loss, it's really best to say deaf or hard of hearing. You'll still maybe sometimes hear hearing impaired. It's not that it's totally out of use, but within the community prefers deaf or hard of hearing for the terms that we use around those ones. So these are just a few examples. I think the bottom line for me is that within the disabled community, which is not a monolith, I say the community as if it's one thing, but there's lots of different diversity happening within that community. It's a very political, personal, and individual choice, and not everyone chooses the same terminology to describe themselves. So personally, whenever possible, I just defer to individuals' choices. And I think it's not really important necessarily to memorize what options are out there. It's more important just to remain responsive, especially when you're in conversation with people and families, for example. I just wanted to throw one resource at you. On this slide, I provided a resource that I visit very often. Even when I work right at this intersection, I really like to make sure that I'm referring to people in groups appropriately. And I found this journalistic style guide that I linked here to be a really nice resource to look up when I don't know what the specific group would prefer that I use. So I just wanted to share that one with you. And now I think it's time to dive into the disability and second language learning to talk more about why disabled students sometimes, but not always, and we'll talk about that, but sometimes find language study challenging and how that can look, how that challenge kind of comes up in classroom settings. So why is language learning and teaching different from other types of content learning? Because I think some people say, well, how is it different? I think ask any language teacher and we will say it is. It is different from other types of learning. And so authors Lesda, Casers, and Thorsten have said, foreign language learning involves both a concerted focus on various language modalities, meaning like those four skills. So you've got the listening, reading, speaking, and writing, and an attempt to build fluency in a language that is relatively new to students, sometimes not in all cases. This is the problem when you pull a quote out of context. You know, it sounds universal, but in fact, it depends on the context that it was pulled out of. The subject matter of a foreign language is inherently different from the subject matter of most other academic disciplines. It's very demanding and it asks a lot of us. It can be very challenging for disabled learners because, as that previous quote mentioned, it engages all four of those skills and sometimes all at once. There's a lot going on. It's also not always, but because it's communicative in nature, it tends to be highly interactive, especially compared to other types of content learning. I mean, it would be nice if other types of learning were always as interactive as language. I think for certain students that would be really beneficial, but there's definitely something inherent to language that makes it sometimes a bit different, right? And it calls on cognitive processes to work in concert with one another, both receptively and productively. The brain is doing a bunch of different stuff all at once, essentially. It also, trickily enough, traditionally assesses physical ability, right? So we're actually sometimes testing hearing ability in the case of listening assessment. We'll talk about that a little bit later on some of the slides. It's also usually, often right now, you notice that I'm hedging with some of these terms because not always, but often it's taught via communicative methods, and that relies a lot on implicit and indirect teaching methods if we're following some of those best practices. Again, not always, but there's certainly a trend to do that um, in recent years. And it also asks learners to react spontaneously. This might be, I'm an okay extemporaneous speaker, but this might be, as a foreign language student myself, my least favorite thing. Having to use the subjunctive on the spot is not my favorite thing. So the spontaneity can also be a tricky thing. But, and here's where I said I was going to come back to this idea, not every disabled student will struggle in learning an additional language. Why is that? Well, for one thing, the same diagnosis doesn't look exactly the same in all people. It's going to look a little bit different in somebody else. That's partially because students have different challenges and resources. Everybody has a different level of motivation, time, energy, family support, sort of maybe coping mechanisms or previous training for learning with a disability, right? And it's also true that sometimes educators have already put in place what a disabled student needs to be successful. So even someone with a disability might be doing fine in the class because of the way the class is designed or the way that the activities are run, for example, right? So all of these things kind of come into play. Flexible policies, inclusive teaching practices, and approachable instructors, those all really go a long way to making the path more hospitable and less cumbersome than it needs to be in language education. So now we'll zoom in on some of the common barriers for disabled students and what we can do about them. So this is where we're starting to drill down now into more concrete information. So some of the common barriers that I'll go over separately, and this is kind of like an overview slide. Conflating logistical rigor with intellectual rigor. I'll explain what all those terms mean when we get there. The physical skill-based learning outcomes and assessment, like I talked about with hearing for listening assessment, right? Indirectness and implicitness, continuous streams of input, spontaneous speech moments, like those ones that I shy away from those, and then a little bit of time for specific linguistic features that depend a little bit on which language is being taught, but, you know, deserves to be talked about it for, you know, at least one slide, I think. So let's start off with this idea of logistical rigor versus intellectual rigor. Logistical rigor disproportionate, sorry, I overclicked. There we go. Logistical rigor disproportionately disadvantages disabled students. Rigid deadlines, strict attendance policies, and certain types of participation, depending on how the grades are designed, are all examples of logistical rigor. Among other concerns, rigidity like that can cause and exacerbate anxiety in students, right? Pryl mentioned in a 2022, I think, article it was actually the Chronicle of Higher Education, but I think it applies to multiple contexts. Intellectual rigor challenges students to explore complex ideas and refine their own thinking. This is holding students to a high standard of learning, which is fine. Whereas logistical rigor focuses on policies and procedures. And the trick there is that, again, when we focus maybe overmuch on policies and procedures, it's disabled students who get caught up in that even more than maybe other students should. So it's important, I think, to return to your learning outcomes or standards to identify where you might be focusing on logistical rigor instead of focusing on intellectual rigor. I think you can think creatively about this. You don't always have to reduce pressure in all of the areas, but you might be able to find some solutions. So, for example, if you can't adjust a final deadline, which is an example of a logistical element, it might not necessarily rise to the level of rigor, but when you have lots of complicated logistics over the term of a course or over a year, there's a lot of ways that disabled students can get caught up in stuff. So, like I said, if you can't adjust a final deadline, fine. Maybe you can get creative and create a policy that allows for revision on every assignment that students have. So you're reducing the fear associated with a high stakes deadline and allow some cushion in case of emergency. Another example I give is, taking points away for spelling. You'll hear me talk a lot about spelling because it's just a really good example. Taking points away for spelling when spelling wasn't the standard of the assignment, right? When we have a rubric that's assessing multiple things, but some of those things are unrelated to the standard that we're working on, maybe take those out and save them for another time so that when you're assessing this one thing, just keep it to the one thing. The more stuff we add, the more we can sort of, if you'll forgive the sort of idiomatic expression or the phrasal verb here, we'll like trip up our students. They get a little stuck when there's too much of that kind of stuff happening. Physical skill-based learning outcomes and assessment or standards. So as I already mentioned, learning outcomes and assessments tied to physical skill, like the listening skill based on hearing capability, right, are, I think, arguably inequitable. I don't think we're going to be able to get rid of them because listening is still something that we want to assess in language. I'm not suggesting that we wouldn't do that, right? But I think that we can reevaluate the fairness of what's being assessed and kind of how we're doing it, right? So individual instructors may not be able to alter the standards themselves, of course, but you might have some flexibility when it comes to assessing the outcomes, depending on, when you're doing your informal or classroom assessments, even summative ones that aren't maybe state mandated testing, right? I'm not talking about standardized tests here. In the example of the hard of hearing student, so in fact, I should give you the whole example. So the example that I often share in this area is if a hard of hearing student reads lips, even to communicate in their home language, then they should be assessed in a way that allows them to use that same skill or coping mechanism in the assessment of listening in their additional language as well, right? So what you could do on assessment is make sure that you're offering video clips that have faces, not just audio clips, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that that student can't test. We just need to maybe redesign the fairness of how we're assessing to make sure that that assessment is reliable and valid for that student, right? I just want to throw out another sort of an important note here. Listening assessment solutions would necessarily be very different for deaf students. And when I say that, I mean deaf with a capital D, which means folks who use signed languages. So sign language users would or should be able to waive out of assessments that are based on hearing. And that's probably the kind of thing that you would see in a student's IEP or something, right? That's usually not the sort of choice of an individual instructor to make at the K-12 level. My point is just to say that when I'm giving that example, I'm specifically talking about hard of hearing, not deafness and the use of sign languages. There is lots of research on that from people who are more knowledgeable about that than I am. So if you're curious, I would encourage you to dig into the research on that a little bit. And then we come to, indirectness and implicitness, like I mentioned earlier. So, like I said, those current communicative language teaching methods are off. Oh, sorry. I keep over clicking. I'm so sorry. Are often very indirect and implicit. But explicit and direct instruction typically much better serve students of a variety of disabilities, especially, for example, learning disabilities, autism, and folks with ADHD or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I think that what's helpful there is to find a balance. We still want to do the implicit and indirect teaching. I think it's just important to find really valuable moments to use the explicit and direct instruction also and make sure that we're achieving the balance. And I don't necessarily mean in the whole group, but certainly also you want a balance there too. But you might be able to find ways of differentiating for individual students to get a little more balance of the explicit and direct stuff that individual students might need, if that makes sense. So be explicit and direct at the times when it's most beneficial for the students. Like the big example that I always give here is when you're giving directions for an activity or an assessment. That's not a moment to have students maybe relying on their implicit and indirect skill base, right? Those might be good times to be explicit and direct. And then we come to continuous streams of input. So long chunks of language or even content, even in the home language, can tax the processing and working memory of disabled students. So students with, again, ADHD often find continuous streams of input very challenging for their working memory. And I've given you a little citation there in case you want to read more of my friend Aga's work. Parsing continuous streams of input was also something that was hard for a student that I interviewed back in, I think, 2018, who didn't have ADHD, but actually had challenges with visual acuity. And he was studying Arabic at the time. So Arabic, those of you who've studied Arabic, it's connected often. The letters are connected kind of in the way that we connect letters in English cursive. And so those long strings of input were really hard for him to find the breaks in. It was hard for him to differentiate between characters. So I just wanted to throw out that other example of it's not always just related to working memory. There might be other reasons why text might be, or long chunks might be hard to parse. So I think it can be helpful to divide long streams of input, especially in earlier practice stages, if you can't do it always. You know, sometimes language study is about building up to a standard, right? At least chunk things up and provide lots of opportunities for playback when it's appropriate for you to do that within your curriculum. And then we come to these spontaneous speech moments that I dislike so much. I don't actually maybe dislike them as much as I say, but it makes for a good example in my presentations. So here we have autistic students and anxious students in particular, but also others, may struggle with spontaneous speech tasks and also a research construct that we call willingness to communicate. And so I've thrown in a couple of citations in case you're curious and want to chase those down. I do think that maybe you can't avoid all spontaneous speech, especially again when it's tied to standards. But there might be little things that you can do that might make a big difference. So I think we can infuse choice in the type of speech tasks that students engage in. Maybe not every time there's a spontaneous task, but sometimes you can give students a little bit of a choice. I think also you can make a point of giving advanced notice. So yeah, the language that's coming is spontaneous, but maybe you know that that activity is coming in advance and that can help with some anxiety, for example. And you can also create some routine around this. So maybe, I don't know, off the top of my head, maybe Fridays are spontaneous speech day. So not only do students know it's coming, but it's always predictable in that sense. And so that can lower the level of some of the anxiety around stuff like that, for example. And again, you're still getting the spontaneous language, but you're tamping down the other parts. It's kind of like it's a little bit like that idea between intellectual or academic rigor versus the logistical rigor part. You're separating out the stuff that doesn't matter as much so that you can really get at the language piece. And then we come to specific linguistic features, and this is one of my most favorite things to talk about. Um, I think we know this already, that specific linguistic features of particular languages can pose difficulty for anybody, especially depending on what language you're coming from, right? But especially for disabled students. And an example is dyslexic students who have additional difficulty with reading when they encounter certain linguistic characteristics. And when I talk about this stuff on this slide, I always give the example of a really wonderful article that's maybe a little bit old now, but I really loved this one. The article, oh, and this is a good moment to say that even the things that don't appear animated on my slides, everything that I'm saying is in the speaker notes of the presentation. So when you have the slides, you basically have a full script of everything I said today. I ad lib a little bit. I changed the language just a tiny bit. But when I mention citations, they're there for you in the speaker notes, even if they're not on the slide. So this 2010 article by an author, Chizer, found that Chizer and two other colleagues found that Hungarian dyslexic learners, for example, incur incur difficulty with non-transparent orthography in English. I'll explain what that means, compared to more predictable structures like in Russian. So in this study, there were secondary students who had already learned as their home language Hungarian. They had already also acquired German as a second language, and now they had the opportunity to choose which third language they wanted to learn. And among their options were English and Russian. For dyslexic students, they would choose Russian because even though there's lots of morphology, there's lots of word endings and things that we have to do in Russian, it's at least much more predictable and you can rely on those rules. Where in English, for example, our spelling is all over the place and it's really hard to tell by the spelling of a word how you pronounce that word, for example. So there's an inherent trickiness in English for dyslexic students who are maybe coming from other language families. So I always like to share that example because I just think it's a really good example of this particular piece, right? Where we choose one language over, we don't always have that choice, right? But in this case, when students did have a choice, they were opting for something that was predictable. So sometimes the language background can help to shorten the distance by offering like familiar features, and there's a familiarity or again a predictability that can kind of create an easier path for students who choose certain languages. Um, so I think really what we do is we need to think about the predictably sticky spots for students whether there's a disability or not, and really be on the lookout for those ones. But then also pay attention, of course, to the patterns that specific students have trouble with over time, right? I think that we can provide extra and targeted resources for the students who find a particular feature difficult. And I think also we can return to the learning outcomes or the standards to make sure, like I've said before, that the assessment is aligned with the right type of rigor and that we're looking only at the one or two things that are really attached to the standard and that we're not doing things that are just logistical, right? So dyslexic students struggle with spelling. I'm not suggesting that we don't teach dyslexic students not to spell appropriately, right? But let's not put spelling into a different standard when we're really looking at something else because you're just adding extra difficulty that in that moment maybe doesn't need to be there, right? Save it for the spelling quiz or the spelling test, right? Standards that are really related to that spelling work. I told you I would bring up spelling a lot. It's just it's a really salient example for some of these things, so that's why I do that. So now I think we'll talk about a couple of different levels of, I call them levels, different areas of accessibility and inclusion, because that accessible input piece is really kind of only one piece of the puzzle. So it's important to consider not only digital and materials accessibility, but also ways to ensure that disabled students have my word that I use is comparable and inclusive experiences and interactions. And so now on the next few slides, we'll talk about accessibility and inclusion more, both in terms of the sort of very concrete accessibility measures, but also this idea of inclusive interaction and experience too. So accessibility is an umbrella term that I use, but it's also sometimes synonymous with making input accessible, like I mentioned. Often we mean digitally, but not always. But again, that's kind of one of the things that comes to mind for people early. So some of them are, some of the more salient barriers for instructors to notice often affect that basic access to input stuff and other content that would be important kind of in any context, not just in language education. An example that I sometimes give here is the textbook. If you have a blind student who needs a screen reader to access input from the textbook and the textbook isn't accessible, that's one level of accessibility that we really need to work on. And it's highly concrete and highly technical, right? There's a very explicit barrier between the student and the information in the textbook in that case. But there's also other examples, like not using a microphone when one is provided in the space. That might mean that, the people who design that space might know that you need a microphone to project all the way to the back of the room. So you'd better use the microphone. So again, we're talking about how do I even get to the information? That's sort of like elemental access, right? So here are some examples of what I mean by that. So when you're choosing images, hopefully for meaning making, not just decor, but we can do that too, and I'll explain that in a minute. We want to describe the images using alt text and image descriptions. You should also describe images verbally when you're explaining or presenting slides. So you may have noticed my slides are perhaps a little on the boring side. I don't have a lot of visuals. There's not a lot going on, but that's because I really want to keep it minimal and I don't want to have to take a whole ton of time describing or tagging even just decorative images that I use. So anytime I use an image, I'm not just going to ignore that it's there and the sighted people see it and the people who don't have sight don't see it. I'm going to say, I've included a decorative image of something on this slide because that brings people into the moment in an inclusive way, right? So I tend to not use images unless they're super important. You don't have to be like me. There are ways of using images super accessibly. I just like to save time and make everything inclusive for everybody from the beginning. But there are ways, I've seen some really lovely accessible presentations that actually do use a lot of images. I just want to present that there's more than one way to do this and still be accessible, right? So I think using purely decorative images and judiciously tagging them either verbally or in like a PDF or something, for example, as decorative, that lessens in a good way the auditory processing load and reduces ambiguity for students using screen reader technology. So for example, the screen reader, we don't quite have enough time today, but you might check out screen reader demos because it's really interesting to see what the screen reader catches and reads and what it doesn't based on the information that it's given. So it'll read image if you don't give it anything. And if you give it a description, it'll read the description. If it's a decorative image, maybe we don't want to waste the time cognitively parsing that information, and we could just say decorative so that the student can read that and move on to the next thing without taking a lot of extra time. There's lots of easily accessible information on the internet about this if you want to Google for alt text and image description stuff. So don't feel that this slide just gets you started and lets you know maybe what to look for, right? There's tons of information that's more easy to find. You don't have to dig into any research. It's a Google search away. So I would say the beginner move here might be to start practicing with alt text now. So when you insert an image in a PowerPoint slide deck, for example, the program will prompt you and automatically give you the window. You don't even have to go in the program and find where to put the alt text. It'll prompt you for that. And sometimes it'll even provide like a first draft description. Don't trust it. They're a good start, but they're not great. They still need the human touch, right, to make sure they're really intuitive and that they make more sense. Sometimes also they just say, this is an image of a screenshot, but they don't give you any information of what's in the screenshot. So it's really important to triple check that. But I do like that the program prompts us to add that extra information. I also want to give a little point here. Don't feel that your image descriptions or your alt text needs to be perfect. If you weren't doing them before and now you're making an effort, someone will really appreciate the gesture of even an imperfect description where there wasn't anything before. I'm not even necessarily all that great at these. I do it reliably now, but I think my descriptions have gotten better over time as I've practiced. So definitely don't worry about being perfect on that. I think the advanced move here might be to choose one platform that you use often in your course design that doesn't automatically prompt you the way that PowerPoint does, for example. So you might go into that app and look around and see where the alt text function is. And then you've already gotten one step ahead of yourself, right? I did this recently with, I have a graduate assistant who works on me in developing some documentation and materials, and we both went into Canva. And it was so much easier. I can't describe now because I can't quite remember where the menu is, but it was way easier to find the alt text feature than I thought it was going to be. So I would suggest go to your most used thing and see if it prompts you. And if it doesn't prompt you, choose another thing and find where it lives in the settings. It's kind of a fun little adventure to find where they've put those settings. I also think it's nice to think about the idea of designing low processing materials or materials that don't require a heavy load of cognitive processing to understand what's going on in them. So examples like this are too much text on a slide can make language difficult to parse. This is why I animate line by line. I don't use super distracting animations, but I do it line by line so you're not just looking at a wall of text, right? I also think that everybody, disabled or not, everybody likes a legible font. You could do a 5-minute Google search and come up with the top 5 most legible fonts. Pick one of them, and that's your favorite font. That's just what you use when creating all of your materials. This is a really great example of how some of the stuff to be accessible is actually very simple. Not all of it is, but some of it is super easy. It's just about making a choice and then getting into a habit. It's also important to provide clear audio recordings and try to play them on the best quality equipment that you have available to you. I'm not suggesting that you go out and buy new stuff necessarily, right? But remember that part of being able to hear something is the equipment that you're hearing it on. And so if you have a super old, I used to teach with very old tape players. We're talking like cassette tapes. And the audio was not very good on those. And it was really nice when we moved to CDs because I don't know why, but the CD players we had were better audio. So just think about how sometimes the technology is also helping or hurting sometimes the way your students interact with some of the materials. So I think, again, the beginner move is probably finding your favorite font and using that from among the list of super legible fonts. The advanced move is just a tiny little choose your own adventure. Go and look online and see the fonts that they have that were specifically designed for dyslexia. I don't use a dyslexia font all of the time, but they're actually super fascinating to look at. It's really interesting to read the research about how they developed those fonts. So just out of curiosity's sake, take 5 minutes and go check that out. I think that's kind of fun. We can also provide multiple modes. So it's really helpful for students to be able to access information in more than one way. For example, video content should ideally be captioned and accompanied by a transcript. That's one of the reasons that I use the speaker notes function in my slides, so that I'm following a script, which helps keep me organized, but it also means that people have access to that information in another way later, not just hearing me say it one time. So the beginner move is to caption your videos. There's free machine captioning available through some platforms like YouTube. Keep in mind, though, that even machine captioning that's, even like 95% accurate, it will still be difficult to understand for someone who's hard of hearing. Part of the beginner move includes reviewing the machine-generated captions for accuracy and editing them with, for example, speaker names or punctuation and other things that might be missing. It doesn't take a ton of time, but I don't want you to think that if you do machine captioning, it's, going to be not even perfect. We don't want to aim for perfect, but well, maybe in captions we do. In general, in accessibility, we don't, and I'll talk about that later. But you still need the sort of human touch to make sure that the machine generated has done what it needs to do. And the advanced move might be to learn the differences between captions, subtitles, scripts, and transcripts. And again, just try to use more of those than you're already doing, whatever that means for you. I think it's important also here to make sure that whatever supports students have in place for classroom practice, like captions, things that might be stipulated in the IEP, of course, they also need to have in place for their assessment and vice versa. So I think it's not super helpful when we have good accommodations for assessments, but not classroom practice, when the same thing, we want to have comparable experiences between practice and assessment. Maybe not all of the practice, right? But when we get closer to it, we don't want students to be using a brand new tool or something they're not used to on an assessment, because again, that affects the reliability and validity of the assessment. I think also if you can't allow students, this is something very specific to language that we don't have to deal with as much in other content learning. If you can't allow students to read content that they're also listening to on an assessment, because then you're testing reading instead of listening, consider offering other supports that might address that challenge. For example, if you can't do captions, then maybe you would offer, like I mentioned earlier, video clips that have faces. So you've got a little bit of extra nonverbal cue to pull from, or maybe the lip reading thing, depending on the case of the student, right? And you could also offer opportunities and time for ample playback. So even when we don't want to give the written version of the language that we're going to be testing the listening of, there might be ways to be a little bit creative about that. So then we come to, so that was all kind of on the level of access, just making sure that students can actually access that linguistic input. But then there's this other piece, or sometimes I call it another level, which is the inclusion piece of creating equitable engagement. So classroom activities might be set up, of course, unintentionally, in a way that they allow for only limited or maybe partial engagement for some students. And I'm going to share an example from my own teaching on the next slide, actually, after this. Inclusion might look like creating equitable and hospitable engagement that motivates students. So I would say, think about an activity that you ran with students this year sometime, Was every student able to engage in that activity as comfortably as their peers could? So maybe think about that for a couple of minutes. The advanced move might be to take a look at your whole curricular plan, or a larger piece of a unit in your course maybe, and highlight any places where not all students might be able to engage equitably. I would say choose one or two of them only to redesign maybe before the next time you teach the class. I'll come back to this idea. We want to do things in bite-sized ways because there's a lot that we can do with accessibility, and we need to keep it manageable because teachers have to do everything. We have to do all the things. So it's really important to, I think, be reasonable about what we can achieve when we're learning something new about some of this access stuff. So here's my own example. If you know this expression from English, I'm going to throw myself under the bus. I'm going to use myself as the example of someone who did something not super, super accessibly, totally by accident. I once used the platform Kahoot in my English language class. So Kahoot is a web-based quiz creation tool that allows you to create a quiz online and then project the question and answers on a classroom projector screen. I'm just sharing that in case any of you haven't used that tool before. Kahoot quizzes can also be timed, and in this particular case, I think I was using that feature. I can't quite remember. So students can access the quiz answers from their smartphones or computers, but on student devices, they don't have the full text. They only have color-coded symbols that correspond to the multiple choice answers that are shown on the projector. So they have some input, but it doesn't exactly match, right? So it's not the full text answer options. So I, in my infinite wisdom, had a visually impaired learner in my class who couldn't read the projector screen. And most of the time in my class, he would use like a magnifier on his phone to magnify worksheets and textbook and other stuff like that. So, this guy was very autonomously in charge of his own. There wasn't much I had to do to help him. Or at least I hope there wasn't, because I think he would have asked. We had a very good rapport. So I forgot that he wasn't going to be able to see the screen in this way, and his phone wasn't going to be able to help him because in Kahoot, the phone doesn't have the same information, right? So in the moment, my ad hoc solution to this was just to read the quiz question and all the answers from the projector out loud so that he had access to the information, right? So this is kind of where we get that difference between the earlier slides and this slide, in this section at least, the accessibility to the input part, but also the interaction piece. So yes, I read it aloud and he listened. It wasn't complicated vocabulary. I think I can be pretty assured that he understood what I said in this case. Again, I'd worked with him for almost a year by that point, right? But I think this is a moment to pause and reflect a little bit. I wanted to think about after that, because I felt very silly for having forgotten this about my student. How did my solution in the moment, which again, for thinking on your feet in the moment when you have a difficulty like that, sure, that's what you would do, right? But how did my solution actually make my student feel in that moment when I had to come up with that solution? And I was left wondering, did my quick fix, which again was what I could do in the moment, fine, did that really foster equitable engagement for that student? I'm going to encourage anybody to pause and think about that for a minute and think about how I thought about that after I had this moment in my classroom. I think that I land on aiming for a comparable experience, and I absolutely should have caught that ahead of time. Since I didn't, I made the right call and I gave access to input. But going back, my on-the-spot problem solving was a less than ideal scenario ultimately for that visually impaired student. They didn't have long-lasting access to that information, right? It's reasonable, I think, to think that I might have overtaxed rather, their working memory, at least compared to other students who could read the projector screen as many times as they want, where this guy is now only dealing with my one audio or oral utterance of the stuff on the screen, right? It's also possible that they or their group could have felt othered, sort of left out or put on the spot because they may not have been able to respond as quickly as the other groups in this sort of quiz game scenario, right? My visually impaired student couldn't, I think, engage in the activity in a comparable way to their classmates. They might not engage in activities in exactly the same way, and I don't necessarily think that aiming for exact equality in that sense is particularly helpful. I think it's more important to think about equity and hospitality to aim to foster comparable experiences in conjunction with, of course, whatever accommodations have been put in the individualized education plan. What's in the IEP for students with diagnosed disabilities always comes first, right? But I think if we aim for comparable and how could I have helped this student participate in a different way where he didn't feel singled out, that was the other word I was looking for, singled out, by my solution, would have been nice. So giving students more than one way to showcase what they've learned is really important. If students are learning about rhetorical moves, for example, in a certain genre of writing, then at some point you are absolutely going to have to assess their use of those moves by writing in that genre, right? If the standard is tied to narrative writing, you're going to have to do narrative writing at some point. But language instructors, I think, know better than most that assignments can be more than essays and slide deck presentations, right? So I think a beginner move might be thinking about the assessments your students have completed, maybe in the last year or so. Is there any flexibility for how students engage with those assignments? Do you think that students might perform differently if they had more flexibility in the way that they respond? You don't necessarily have to find flexibility in every single assignment, though, right? This goes back to the idea that you don't have to do it all the time, all of the places. But you might be able to offer what we call some voice and choice somewhere over the duration of the course. You might be able to give some students some choices and topics or the modality that they choose. The solutions don't have to be all or nothing, right? You might want to read about one way that I found to use a rubric that unbinds the assessment from modality requirements. I call it a universal rubric. I'm not sure maybe what other people call it, but it refocuses the assessment on the intellectual rigor and the standards and takes that logistical piece out of it, right? So I wanted to link here on the slide for you an article that I wrote with a colleague about using something that's called open format assignments, where you really focus on the standard, but the way that the student shows you the standard that they're working on has multiple ways of happening, and you can give students a lot of choice of how they want to do that for you. And we've already reached the time. I can't believe that was quick. The moment of my parting advice. So I think one of my biggest pieces of advice that I leave instructors with is try to strike a balance. Use what's available to you that suits the situation best. You don't have to use every item from every checklist at every moment. It's more about knowing what your options are and pulling from them when it's useful to you and your students, right? And hopefully that helps you lean into the feeling of opportunity that you have a lot of resources to draw from, but not feeling overwhelmed that you have to use all of them all of the time. Ideally, I think we could use a combination of accommodations, both the planned, sorry, overclicking, and both the planned type, but also that ad hoc support that just happens in the classroom when we see that students are struggling, right? So of course this means IEPs and anything that's set out that must be used to help a student, but also those things that just teachers always do all of the time, repeating the directions for someone who wasn't paying attention and, all of those things. So we're going to do all of that stuff. We also might use things like universal design frameworks to think about some of the things that I've mentioned in the presentation today and think about designing lessons in advance, even before we know which students are going to come to us with IEPs or specific needs, right? And then also trying to vary our instructional practices, drawing on, for example, it's not the only option, but maybe differentiation. This is one thing that comes up a lot for disabled language learners. I also think it's helpful to make a little bit of a plan. I think you could probably choose one thing to implement in your class today. Just pick one thing from what I've mentioned today that you weren't already doing and try to do that thing. Try it even just one time. Maybe this is the day that you'll decide to pick a favorite readable font and only use that font for the rest of your materials creation in the rest of the year, right? Or maybe you'll take the summer to redesign some of your materials with a favorite font. Or maybe you'll choose one thing that you want to learn more about and dedicate 15 minutes in the month, people, not very much time at all. Just dedicate 15 minutes to Googling about it over the next month. And then set a reminder for next month, because I think that's important too. You're gonna hopefully, I don't mean to pat myself on the back, but hopefully you'll come away motivated to try some of this stuff today. But we get busy and life happens. Don't make yourself feel guilty about that. Just set the reminder for next month and get back into it. Progress is always helpful. I think it's also important to be realistic about what we can achieve, right? So access and inclusion are, sorry, overclicking again. I'm getting very excited about the next stuff to say. Access and inclusion are something that we should have been trained to do from the beginning, but often we weren't, at least not in super concrete ways with really helpful resources. So if we haven't yet had the opportunity to learn some of these things and make some good habits, yeah, it's probably going to feel like more work on top of everything else we're already doing. But there's good news. Hopefully you've gotten the good news vibe from this webinar today. There's a lot that we can do with pretty minimal effort that can make an enormous impact for students, right? Imagine if you did the font thing and then you also did alt text and you chose one other thing and you implemented those the next time you teach. That's already a lot to start with. That's a really good place to start, I think. It's also true that the solutions, like I've said a few times, they don't have to be all or nothing. You don't have to be flexible across the whole course. You don't have to give students choice on every single assignment, but you can do it in the small places where it's not giving away too much for you to do that, right? It's not a high stakes moment to make those choices. You can try out the bite size low stakes options and that's good progress too. I think we want to aim for progress, not perfection. Students have needs, but so do educators, right? And both of those are legitimate and worthwhile and valid. I think that you can find a sweet spot where you're supporting students in the way you have to in IEPs, and you're also supporting them in the other ways when they don't have diagnosed disabilities, right? As we always do. And you still won't have to grade 30 late assignments, for example, or something, right? It doesn't have to be those two extremes. And then the last thing that I already said, but I think bears repeating, please don't berate yourself when things get busy and you let some of these things slide, or you miss your planning moment of 15-minute Googling that Caitlin told you to do. I just think it's important to get back into it when you can. And again, keep in mind that we're aiming for progress. Any increase in accessibility and inclusion is wonderful. We don't need to aim for perfection. I always say to my graduate students, for example, you haven't met all of the students that you're ever going to teach yet. So you can't possibly make things 100% accessible until you've met them and you know, even if you learn about some of their needs from documentation before you meet them or before you have them in class, you always have to leave room for you're going to learn something a little bit later in the process and you're going to be responsive and adapt to that. And that's why, accessibility work is not about perfection, it's about progress. Thank you so much for having me today. I'll put up my last slide, which again, as promised, has the QR code that'll lead you to the slides, and it also has a link to some of the key references and some additional resources that I mentioned in the talk today. Thanks again so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. This opens the new door for me, actually. A lot of times I don't think about those details, nuances, and differences. Because a lot of times we're teaching what language, we're thinking about, oh, okay, this work, we only care, a lot of times we only care about their cultural background, ethnic
Yes.
background. A lot of times we don't even think about their students with like IEP plans,
Yeah.
and they are
Yeah.
different. And
Yeah.
their needs, and their what they, you know, they have different needs
Yeah.
when they are learning. And this is new to me, and I really learned a lot. I appreciate that. I
I'm
never
so
think
glad.
about the accessibility problem, you know.
Well, part of the reason this is so hard is because, and again, I don't mean to say that language teachers are the heroes. But it's true that all educators are, and everybody's got a lot to do. But in language
Yeah,
education, to do it well, we have so much already to hold in our minds. All of the best practices, like you said, to be mindful about cultural background, which is super important, right? We already have a list of super important stuff that we're trying to do in the classroom, and now we're just adding one more layer, but it is a super important layer, and that's why I tell people don't feel guilty about what you weren't doing before. Don't feel guilty about what you aren't able to do next month. Every little bit is super helpful. And so if we can keep that happy, opportunistic motivation and not become too frustrated, I think it's a really healthy way to move forward with some inclusion work.
yeah, and I also like the way you say we can just be better. I
Yeah.
mean, like bite size,
Bite sized. Yeah.
improve a little bit by bit. That
Yeah.
really helps.
Yeah.
Takes off all the stress.
I hope so, because I understand when I come with this huge list of things in a presentation, it's just because I want you to know what options are out there, not that you
Yeah,
need to tackle every single thing the next time, you're in class with your students.
yeah. Thank you so much. This is very, very helpful. I
I'm so
really
glad.
appreciate.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
me.
Thank you. Have a nice day, and
Thank
let's keep
you.
in touch. Thank you.
Sounds great. Thanks.
Bye.